All right, folks, it is the top of the hour. So I would like to thank you for joining us this evening for our OER project session or OER project present session for the month of January. I'm very excited about our speaker this evening, and I will introduce Dr. Sivasundaram in just a minute. But before we get started, I did want to just call out a couple of things. The first one is we are going to be giving away 5 of the books that our speaker has written to 5 lucky people. That is going to be chosen at random tomorrow. So you'll receive an email message congratulating you if you are one of the random folks who have received one of our speaker's books. The second thing is please feel free to keep your camera on this evening. We love when folks keep their cameras on just because it increases engagement. We get to see you and you get to see us. But because this session is recorded, feel free to also leave your camera on. We also want this session to be engaging. So there'll be opportunities for you all to interact with us as well through the evening. And sorry, I'm admitting folks and speaking to you all at the same time. So without further ado, I am going to read the bio and then I will let our speaker get into this exciting session that we have today. So Sujit Sivasundaram is a professor of world history at the University of Cambridge and fellow in history at Gonville and Caius College, Cambridge. He was born and educated in Sri Lanka and has degrees in history and philosophy of science from the University of Cambridge. He is a leading historian specializing in world history, especially the Pacific and Indian Oceans and their islands in the 18th and 19th centuries, and also environmental history, the history of race, imperial history, and history of science. He is taught at the LSE and held visiting positions in Paris, Singapore, Sydney, and Munich. He was awarded the Philip Leverhulme Prize for History in 2012. Ways Across the South, A New History of Revolution and Empire is his third book. It was awarded the British Academy Book Prize in 2021. He has also served as a Sackler-Card Fellow at the National Maritime Museum and is currently president of the Pacific Circle, a group of scholars devoted to the study of knowledge and environment across the Indian and Pacific Oceans. He was editor of the Historical Journal and serves on various editorial boards, including for past and present. So everyone, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Sujit Sivasundaram.
Thank you very much, Ebony, and it's very nice to join you. It's actually kind of midnight here in the UK, so I'm actually hoping that I'll be able to deal with all your questions while still being awake. But it's a real pleasure to actually kind of introduce this work that I did for Waves Across the South to all of you as historians working in school contexts, and to actually kind of understand how the new literature on the Age of Revolutions might feed into schools. So when I wrote this book, Waves Across the South, which Ebony just kindly introduced, it was really very much in my mind that I'd like for it to feed into the teaching of history at schools for this vital topic of the Age of Revolutions. So that really is part of the agenda for this evening. So just as a way of introducing the book and setting it in a historiographical landscape, let me actually just show you the cover of the book, which hopefully you can all see right now. So it's a history of the Indian and Pacific Oceans in the Age of Revolutions. So that's the first thing to say. And yes, my kind of position here at the University of Cambridge is as a world historian. And people often ask me, what is world history? Partly because it's not a category that's very well known in the UK. I think it's more well known in the US, and people say, is it the history of everything? And I have to quickly say, well, no, it's not the history of everything. And particularly in this case, and in this book, this is a book on two oceans, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. But the method of the book really is to make particular places, particular small sites, islands, coastlines matter to this broader narrative of the Age of Revolutions. So it's not the case that the whole of the Indian Ocean and the whole of the Pacific Ocean shares the same history in the Age of Revolutions, but rather methodologically, it's trying to make space for a particular kind of world history where these small sites scattered over great distances of ocean actually have histories which resonate with, but which are distinctive within the broader narrative of the Age of Revolutions. So really the story that the book is tracking is the story of revolution as well as counter-revolution. And those are the two big concepts that I illustrate. And that's very much in keeping with what's happening in the broader literature on the Age of Revolutions. People are in the Atlantic Ocean as well, insisting that we need to think about how revolution ends and how revolution is subverted, and that we need to think about counter-revolution as well. And counter-revolution here in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean is often imperial as we go into the 1830s and the 1840s. We see the rise of the British Empire in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, partly because of the loss of North America to the British, the whole idea of a swing to the east. And so here, what I'm arguing for is that the British Empire and the rise of the British Empire in the East is a counter-revolution set against the revolutionary culture of a whole series of indigenous peoples who inhabit the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean. So if the two main concepts are revolution and counter-revolution, they are inhabited, or they kind of indicate, on the one hand, indigenous peoples stretched who reside in very different sites, island sites across the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, facing the counter-revolution of growing imperialism, mostly British, but also including other empires, Dutch, French, and even at times Eurasian. So the book is trying to sketch how this sort of dynamic of revolution to counter-revolution sort of happens through particular life stories. So the method of the book is to actually make to kind of cast various fragments of archival sources together in order to reconstruct specific indigenous lives and colonial lives as they engage with each other in these ocean territories. So the idea is that indigenous peoples assembled, they protested, they exercised their agency, they associated with each other in various associations in this era. And so that constitutes really what revolution and revolutionary practice looks like for these indigenous peoples. And that on the other side, the empires that came into this space of revolution sought to fold into the structures of empire, that agency and that ideology. So, for instance, the British Empire famously wished to cast itself as an empire for liberty. It also sought to incorporate within itself indigenous elites who were articulating new ideas. So if revolution actually in practice meant the assembly and association and presence of a whole series of kind of assertive presence of a whole series of indigenous peoples in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, some of those practices were actually kind of adopted and subverted by the imperial structures that came into this space, partly because indigenous liberal thinkers started to work within the edifices of empire, or the British sort of circulated a language of liberty in order to stem the progress of rebellion and revolt. So that just gives you a sense of the broader kind of narrative of the book. Let me now just say a little bit about how it stands in historiography. So the reason I wrote this book partly is because, well, I did some work on the Pacific first for my PhD. In this period, I was looking at the voyages of, I guess, the period between the voyages of Captain James Cook and Charles Darwin, so from the late 18th century up to the early 19th century. And then I wrote a book on the Indian Ocean, also in the same period. And then suddenly I realized that actually the thing that tied it together was the concept of the Age of Revolutions. Because for the first book, which was an account of the consolidation of science in the Pacific, it was really clear that the kind of contestations over what was science and whose science it was actually were framed by this sort of revolutionary tussle, the Age of Revolutions. And in the Indian Ocean, when I was writing a book on Sri Lanka, actually, I realized that, in fact, the British taking of Sri Lanka can also be framed around the Age of Revolutions. Sri Lanka, the coastal territories of Sri Lanka were Dutch. There was a concern in the Indian Ocean about the advance of the French, and that's one of the contexts for what happens in Sri Lanka as well. So having thought about both those things, I suddenly realized that in the broader literature of the Age of Revolutions, these sites just did not feature at all, because the Age of Revolution story that is taught in schools, that is taught at universities, is a very Atlantic story. And so I became very committed to the idea of actually kind of taking that Atlantic narrative to these sites on the other side of the world, and demonstrating why they matter to the Age of Revolution's story. And so, to bring Aboriginal Australians, Pacific Islanders, Malays, Mauritians, the Sinhalese people of Sri Lanka, or the Tamil people of Sri Lanka, into the Age of Revolutions in a sustained way for the first time. Now, as I started to think about it, I realized that in the traditional historiography of the Age of Revolutions, really the conception was that, in a sense, not only was it geographically centered on the Atlantic, the implication of this geographical centering was that a whole series of things happened first in the Atlantic. So, democracy happens in the Atlantic, then industrialization happens in the Atlantic, that nation states come from this part of the world, that forms of resistance are forged here. Selfhood takes a particular form in the Atlantic sphere. And so if one is actually a historian of the world outside the Atlantic, this is quite unacceptable, because in a sense, and here one can follow Hobsbawm, for instance, who's on the screen, one has to wait for the age of decolonization for there to be an age of revolutions in Asia. Because that is sort of derivative of this prior age of revolutions. So in a sense, the idea is that there's a kind of chronological gap between the Atlantic's age of revolutions and an age of revolution, and the possibility, the occurrence of an age of revolutions in the world outside the Atlantic, or the Euro-Atlantic. So that obviously is a really problematic assumption of anyone working on Asia or East Africa or the Pacific. But it's not just that assumption, it's also the assumption that actually, things like the reform of labor, or forms of new militarism, or the creation of new political structures, a whole variety of things that we associate with the Age of Revolutions, that they should be centered on this Atlantic story without attention to the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. I think I got slightly carried away in the book in saying that the soul of the world in this narrative is crafted in the Euro-Atlantic world. And so then, what happens to the wider world beyond it? Where does its sort of sense of rights or citizenship or democracy actually kind of come from? Does it need to kind of wait for a later period if we follow this track of historiography? So that was one of the kind of intentions of the book, but it's actually really dangerous to say that nobody has done something like this before, because actually I would argue that though it's quite different to a lot of the standard narratives of the Age of Revolutions, which center on the Atlantic, in some ways it is following in the general track of the historiography of the Age of Revolutions, because a lot of historians have tried to kind of go global with the Age of Revolutions in various ways already, right? So, on the bottom left is just one work, but one can think of Lynn Hunt's work more broadly. Various historians of the French Revolution trying to kind of argue that the French Revolution is a global event in the sense that it happened because of global forces, the impact of war or economic change on France, but also that it had a kind of global impact outwards, so both inwards and outwards, that it was kind of forged as a global event. Or, David Armitage arguing that the Declaration of Independence, goes out from the Atlantic world to a wider sphere globally. So this kind of argument about the global diffusion of certain kind of processes, certain moments of revolution or certain acts of revolution is already established in the literature. In addition to that, I think what's evident in the extant literature is also that there is a kind of transnational turn in this literature. So, for instance, Janet Pulaski's book is looking across a whole series of borders of Europe. And we're going to see a new book by Nathan Pearl Rosenthal, which is just being published this week, I think, which once again is trying to bring in various sites in Europe, America, and Latin America together. So this sort of thing of trying to kind of stretch the geography of the Age of Revolutions was already happening before the book was published. It was also the case, and that there, in the Atlantic literature of the Age of Revolutions, that there has been increasing attention to perspectives from below. So certainly the perspectives of enslaved peoples. I know that in school syllabi in the US, there's been this push to kind of include the Haitian Revolution, which was a really important thing to add to the teaching of the Age of Revolutions. But certainly the perspective of, a whole series of people of color have been added into the literature, and their kind of personhood has also been added into the literature. I suppose in some ways the geography of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean is still quite different from a focus on West Africa and the Caribbean and Latin America, which is something that was already happening. Partly because it brings in the history of Islam in new ways, though Islam is operating in West Africa. It brings in a whole series of cultures, some of which have had long-standing contact with each other across the Indian Ocean world. For instance, thinking about the Indian Ocean world trading system, which is long-standing prior to the late 18th century. So I think new challenges arose in writing the book, given that though the Age of Revolutions literature was already moving in this sort of transnational, globalizing sort of way, if one were, as I tried to do, if I tried to take it to the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, there were other kind of problems in the sense that, should one use the term indigenous for a whole series of peoples, some of whom were migrants themselves across the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And should one bring the literature on, say, India together with Australia, though that's quite an unorthodox thing to do because one is a settlement colony and one's normally a colony of trade, etc. So there were various issues that then arose historiographically because of the novelty of the geography of waves across the South. But this just gives you an indication, really, of some of the works that were helpful as starting points. And the one on the far right is very close to the orientation of Waves Across the South. This is the book Facing Empire, which is an edited volume, which tries to actually make precisely the same point, that it is possible to think about the Age of Revolutions in relation to Pacific peoples, Maori, Tahitian, Australian Aboriginal, and so on, in addition to people in Asia. So I think that point was already there in the literature as well. So that just gives you a sense of where the book fits into the classic literature of Hobsbawm and Palmer, and why it's very different to that in terms of or it's kind of reacting against that by trying to show that the roots of democracy and certain structures like the nation state or forms of knowledge actually can have origins outside the story of the Atlantic, but that there are other scholars already working in this vein, in this field, before Waves Across the South came out. So now that was the kind of historiographical introduction. I'm going to pause there in case people kind of want to raise questions about historiography before we go forward. Any questions, anyone? Yeah, I think Christopher's got a question. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Professor. I was curious if there's any historiography linking the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Sea, trying to link that is centering those parts of Africa and Southwest Asia, and maybe connecting them with the Indian Ocean as well. Just curious about that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Christopher. So there's a whole chapter in Waves Across the South on the Persian Gulf. And I was very, very keen to bring the Persian Gulf in, partly because, I mean, I knew about the so-called Wahhabi kind of movement in the Persian Gulf, which is enacting a program of reform and raiding holy sites. But I wanted to tell that story in a much more complex way, I guess, without just making it about reformist Islam. And so the story I sort of mounted in the chapter on the Persian Gulf is partly about a whole series of different kinds of Islam, including from Oman, Ibadism, and including Persia as well, and how these are all in contest around processes of trade and slavery, and then how they encountered the British coming in and trying to make treaties with them and to kind of regulate this activity, which they cast as piracy from British Bombay. So in a sense, I mean, that just kind of allows me also to just make a point about the methodology of Waves Across the South. So it's partly a question of, what scale we use in telling the history of the Age of Revolutions or teaching the history of the Age of Revolutions. Some of the books on the screen right now are making a case for global history, which is, the history of the French Revolution going everywhere or being forged by events far and wide. But really what I tried to do in Waves Across the South is to make space for small Cs, as I call them. So certainly the whole of the Indian Ocean and the whole of the Pacific Ocean is the subject of the book, but the chapters are divided according to the Persian Gulf, the Bay of Bengal, the Tasman Sea, the Southwest Indian Ocean. And the implication here is that actually each of these sites with their islands, with their coastlines, has a kind of distinctive story, and that students, readers, scholars can do well to actually respect the distinctive features of the Age of Revolutions in each of these locales. And so I guess in classrooms and as we kind of write books or whatever, we should probably kind of just think through how to pluralize the Age of Revolution so that people can understand that it actually means different things in different places. And even within the Persian Gulf, there's a variety of different actors, not a singular kind of Islam or a singular kind of trade operating here as well.
Thank you very much.
I see Dan, and there's a question in the chat box to say, does this include the Ottomans?
Yes, it does include the Ottomans. In fact, sorry, yeah, I mean, it's been a couple of years since I wrote, or a few years since the book came out, so I'm forgetting. But basically, with the Persian Gulf story, I think I thought of it as like concentric circles almost. So certainly the Gulf, and then Persia, Oman, what becomes Saudi Arabia. But then beyond that, the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire in India. And so really, all of these sorts of forces were radiating into the Gulf. Yeah, I mean, Oman, trying to kind of respond to the Wahhabi movement, for instance. But as I say, just have a look at the chapter on the Persian Gulf in the book.
Dan?
Thanks
Dan, where you go? Oh, there you go.
Yeah,
sorry.
thanks for taking my question. This is really fascinating. I'm teaching about the Age of Revolutions in my high school world history class right now. So this is great. I'm thinking about sort of the narrative frame of the Age of Revolutions. And it seems like while all of the books that you're showing on the screen now in some way challenge that narrative frame, but they also kind of accept it. I'm curious if work has been done kind of more directly, sort of questioning whether that's sort of, or offering another sort of narrative frame for this period in world history.
So by a narrative frame, Dan, do you mean the story of the French Revolution, like the American Revolution, French Revolution, Industrial Revolution, Haiti? I mean, just the fact that the sequence over those successive dates and processes of causation, maybe, or news even traveling between them, or something like this, or what is the narrative? Is that the narrative?
That's what I'm thinking, and I'm not. I mean, I understand I understand that as a narrative frame, but I'm just curious if in the literature there have been historians that have again more perhaps directly kind of challenged that, or offered an alternative for looking at this particular period.
Yeah, so I mean, I think I am trying to challenge that narrative with Waves Across the South, because I'm saying that's an Atlantic narrative, and it doesn't include all these other events. It doesn't include slave revolts in the Cape Colony. It doesn't include Republican associations in Mauritius, or in Mysore in South India, or the taking of Tasmania as a sort of thing that happens because of tussles between the British and the French. So I think in a whole series of ways, moments of revolt, moments of association, moments of imperialism, which are forged out of the Age of Revolutions, don't feature in that established narrative. Having said that, it's very hard to form a cohesive alternative narrative, partly because you're not going to find an event of the same sort of scale as the French Revolution or the American Revolution. A lot of these other events, revolts and so on, are much smaller in terms of their scale. But the way I respond to that is by saying that actually, we shouldn't just kind of make certain events iconic. I think sometimes, there's a way in which continuous revolt over a whole series of years in particular locales can be really consequential for those places as well. So we shouldn't, in a sense, just go for the big. As historians, we should actually have space for more pronounced or more sustained kind of longer term modes of revolt as well. And I guess there's a question of periodization as well that then opens up, because if we kind of broaden the span of the Age of Revolutions, when does it end? So my book ends with 1848 as the sort of endpoint of the Age of Revolutions, partly because it allows me to think about revolts in the 1830s in the Indian Ocean. And 1848, there's a big revolt in Sri Lanka, and the chapter on 1848 includes Southern Africa, Mauritius, and Sri Lanka, and movements against the arrival of convicts, and the setting up of various associations, and then actually a major revolt. So those are the three sorts of things that happen in 1848 across that circuit at three places. But some people will say that's too late for the Age of Revolutions. But I think if we are to be inclusive geographically, then we probably need to kind of experiment with different timelines as well. So I'm not really answering your question. I'm just kind of saying that it's difficult to kind of forge a sort of a simple narrative that replaces the one that already exists. But maybe it's an opportunity for students to think about how to pluralize the narrative, or how to kind of, how does it maybe it's a question about, what is a period after all, right? I mean, this is a label, this is one of the most long-standing labels of periodization, because it was used in the period and it carried on being used, and we are still using it now. So it's a really long-standing label of historical periodization. If it is such, then what does it mean to pluralize it now when we're trying to pluralize history in a whole series of ways? Does it mean that we need to, stretch it out, or, not have a kind of linear periodization, and respect the fact that maybe it operates on different timelines in different parts of the world, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, I mean, another way to kind of answer your question is to say that the way I kind of think about narrative in the book is through lives rather than events, and that actually was, for me, a really useful way of getting around this question of, which event follows which event. Because if I could just this is a word I use in the book, repopulate the Age of Revolutions, with a whole series of life stories of Aboriginal people in Australia and Mauritians and so on, that actually could give it a narrative cohesion. And so in some ways, in teaching it, I try to kind of think, which lives should I use? and then how can those lives actually kind of bring the period to life, rather than specific events.
We have two more questions before you move on.
Yeah.
So the first question is about primary sources. And so we know that's really important for one creating a work such as you have. But is there a place that you went to get primary sources about or to help you write Waves of the South? But they're looking for documents to be able to use in the AP classroom.
Yeah. There isn't a kind of bank of sources already out there, I fear. But what I will do is I will try and find some. So the book is based on lots of archival work. So the archival sources aren't readily available. That they're in archives in Mauritius and in various difficult to access places, which I traveled to before the pandemic, and before we became really concerned about taking too many flights and so forth. Yeah, so it was a different age of research when I was able to do all this traveling and collecting data from archives. But there are some published sources which might be interesting. So it depends very much on, if you're building a lesson about this. You probably, will need to keep the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Haitian Revolution in. You can't get rid of them. But then, do you want to add in a couple of other cases from the wider world to make people think about where the literature is moving? If so, which cases should be included? For instance, why not include some travel writing from the Pacific? It's really great. Students really kind of respond very well to explorers' diaries. So there are these French expeditions, which I write about in the book, especially d'Entrecasteaux's expedition, which actually is disbanded as a result of the Age of Revolutions. The ships are sold. The specimens are divided up between the British and the French. The whole kind of crew divides according to whether they're royalists or republicans. And this is when the expedition arrives in Surabaya in Indonesia. And I think a source like that, which is there are lots of published sources from these expeditions, the French expeditions, as well as the British expeditions. Those could be quite a nice thing to kind of add to a lesson, perhaps. But if one wants a kind of an event, I guess, or a figure, shall we say, someone like Tipu Sultan of Mysore, who is the prince in Mysore, which is the kingdom in South India. He is an Islamic ruler who is vilified by the British as an Oriental despot. But one of the reasons he's vilified as an Oriental despot is because he has extensive connections with the French. And there are a whole series of Republicans who turn up at his court. And there are various different ways of interpreting what happens here. And some people say maybe the British are exaggerating the story, but there are certainly Republican processions, and there is a Republican club in Mysore. So some accounts there's various flags flown and so forth. He also sends an embassy to Mauritius, which is a center of republicanism in the Indian Ocean, to get support. So something like that, which is a kind of, there's lots of information about Tipu Sultan of Mysore online. There are several images of him online. There are banks of there's lots of material culture from Tipu Sultan's court, which you can look at, or which students can look at. So I think something like that may work as well as a set of sources. But yeah, I'm happy to sort of advise people because I think I'll be answering some questions in the next few days on sources if people would want to kind of work on how to add. It depends very much on what kind of thing would work with the lesson that you have, or a syllabus that you have, I guess. I don't teach in the US, so I'm maybe tell me if I'm getting anything wrong, by the way. I might mistake.
No. I think that's the value of this conversation tonight, is that you don't teach in the US, so you can provide an additional perspective that we may not always get here in the States. The next question for you are, what are the arguments for decoupling revolution from the Western narrative of revolutions being tied to the European Enlightenment conceptions of rights? More so, how do we articulate those arguments?
Okay, I'm going to look for that question because that's a
Yes,
where is it on the chat?
it is on the chat. Yes, it was asked by Tyrone Shaw.
Okay, what are the arguments for decoupling revolution from the Western narrative of revolution being tied to European Enlightenment conceptions of rights? Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And the way I did this book is not the only way to write about the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean in the late 18th century and the late 19th century. There's a whole lot of stuff. There's a lot of history going on in that part of the world, which doesn't fit in the age of revolutions in this period. Asian trade across, bypassing European imperialists is one example. So it's not, I guess I'm quite clear in the book that this isn't a comprehensive history of these regions in this period. Rather, it's an analysis of what the age of revolutions looks like for these regions. And I think that's a really important kind of distinction to make, because otherwise it could be misread as an imposition of a European or Atlantic periodization on the wider world, where maybe it's ill-suited. So that's the first thing to say in response to that question. The second thing to say is, I'm committed to actually talking across geographical areas. So I think there's a lot to be said for an Asian historian, a Pacific historian, actually kind of engaging with the Age of Revolutions literature and thinking through what that might look like in that region, because otherwise history just gets bifurcated into different regions and people are not able to kind of talk across those regional divides. So I guess, yes, I'm not decoupling in the terms of the question. So Tyrone asks, what are the arguments for decoupling revolution from the Western narrative of revolution? Which I take to mean that there might be a different kind of, that it's, there's a different history out there to the Western narrative. This is an exercise in decentering the West, but it's trying to decenter the West with the West's terms. So it's a bit sort of naughty in some ways, because it's kind of like taking the institutions and saying, actually let's repopulate it and let's reconceptualize it, but let's not give it up. Let's trouble this concept which is at the center of the emergence of the modern West. But yeah, there are other ways of being less of decentering Europe as well. Does that answer the question? I don't know whether I've misunderstood it, but that's how I read that question.
You did a great job. I just wanted to also add, it's a little bit for me, trying to get my students to understand the concept of revolution, that it's not an entirely Western concept, right?
Yeah.
Revolutions happened in other parts of the world, and people didn't need to have like the European language of enlightenment in terms of rights in that way to conduct revolution. And so getting them away from that solely, we had enlightenment, then we had revolution, and America, France, Haiti, and Latin America, and that's it, So just getting them to understand that there's more to that concept of revolution than how we necessarily conceive of it. And I mean, in my early teaching career, I was like, that was my language that I use mostly, and I've tried to push away from that. So I was just trying to think of what are some other ways that we could message that to students.
Yeah, no, I mean that's what it's trying to do. It's trying to say that revolution happens elsewhere at the same time as it happens in the Atlantic. One doesn't have to wait 150 years for it to happen in the world outside the Atlantic. It's actually happening simultaneously. And I think it's kind of happening in two ways. That there is an existence sense of revolution. Say, Inqilab is a sort of concept in the Indian Ocean world of upheaval. So in various linguistic traditions, there are different kind of ways of thinking about revolution, which predate this moment in this part of the world and which feed into this moment. But that's one way in which it happens. But it's also the case that the European concept of revolution is being adopted and reutilized in creative fashion by indigenous peoples in order to, say, well, I mean, you said that there will be a reform of labor, and this is actually what happens in Cape Town in 1808. The rumor spreads about abolition, and then there is a sort of a revolt of enslaved people. So I think this whole idea that this is a revolutionary era because there is revolution elsewhere, there has to be revolution here, and so the European concept of a reform and revolution can be utilized in creative fashion as well. So I think it's both the kind of existence of revolution prior to and irrespective of Europe, as well as the creative manipulation of the Euro-Atlantic concept of revolution.
I think we have one more question for you before we move on. And this is a follow-up to Dan's question. So how then is a revolution defined in the Indian and Pacific Ocean? Are the revolutions explained in the book as social, political, intellectual, etc.? Just trying to find ways to frame the ideas for students to understand.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. It's hard to answer because I've had to be. I mean, the book is very inclusive of a whole series of different kinds of revolution. So when I was first starting to talk about the book a few moments ago, I was trying to kind of do this, but maybe I should try again. So revolution is, in the terms of the book, the association of, the assembly of, the protest of, or the assertive presence of indigenous peoples. So that's the way it's defined. And so it's a kind of indigenous-led phenomenon. And it can be about gathering, it can be about a political statement. But at times, partly because of some of the context here being extremely genocidal, it can even be about asserting presence. So that's the way in which it's defined. Defined like that, it can be political, social, cultural, etc., etc. So it's very wide. Now that's a different way of thinking about revolution to thinking about it as a singular event, and that's one of the complications of this sort of approach. But maybe, I mean, if one is talking to a school kid, or I mean, as I would to a first-year undergraduate, I probably would say, why should is revolution always an event, or can it be an everyday practice as well? Or I mean, that would be one way I would approach it. Or are there situations where it's impossible for there to be a revolution, like the Haitian Revolution or whatever, and where other modes of resistance and response need to be, adopted. So in a sense, kind of assessing why the story looks like this in this context, and also why we take revolution to mean certain kinds of things, like events, rather than kind of longer term processes. Is that the final question now?
Yeah, that's it. We're ready to move
Okay,
forward.
fine. So, okay, we are going to move forward. And actually, I'm going to show you Epele Haofa, who inspired this book partly, who was an anthropologist and historian of the Pacific, and who actually kind of made the point, and this nicely relates to what I've just been talking about, that small islands matter. So he conceived of the Pacific as our sea of islands. Now, in calling the Pacific our sea of islands, what he was trying to do was he was trying to dislodge a view of this part of the world as islands in a far sea. So islands in a far sea is a kind of colonial conception of the Pacific, because there are these small specks of land far away, which are very isolated, and they're far away from the centers of history and civilization. But he was trying to invert that idea of islands in a far sea with our sea of islands, meaning that the sea is inhabited by people. It's a place of indigenous energy and residence, and ownership. So that was, I mean, that's just one of the things that he does in his writings. But it's that kind of idea of how the sea is a place of, history and politics for indigenous peoples that's really central to the way the book is written. And methodologically, it's trying to make the point that small things can matter. Small revolts can matter, but also small islands can matter and small ports can matter in world history as well. So we don't need, the continental kind of story alone, or a capital R revolution for the age of revolutions. But I'd be interested to know how you respond to that in terms of teaching it in schools. Okay, so that then allows me to tell you kind of two stories. The book, as I mentioned earlier, is organized according to these small Cs. So we talked a little bit in passing about the Persian Gulf there earlier. But what I want to do in the first story is to go to the Tasman Sea, to the north coast of Tasmania. In these chapters on particular small seas, what I'm trying to do is to actually kind of think about the coastline surrounding those seas as well. And in the chapter on the Tasman Sea, which includes the north coast of Tasmania, it also includes the foundation of the colony of New South Wales, which was founded in 1788. So in the year before the French Revolution. But in a lot of the literature on the founding of New South Wales, there isn't much reflection on the fact that it was the year before the French Revolution, but I think that's actually a very significant fact for this story. And the chapter also includes New Zealand in it. So it's trying to kind of work through the relationship between these three sites of indigenous presence and colonial activity. But here I'm just going to have time to quickly tell you the story from Tasmania, to give you a sense of the kinds of material in the book. So the first thing to say is that there's a race to plant a flag on the island of what is now Tasmania, because a French voyage heads out of Sydney by Baudin, headed by Baudin, and immediately as soon as that French voyage leaves Sydney, the rumor spreads that the French are going to come and take Tasmania and make it a French colony. And it's in that context that then an English ship is set out from Sydney to go and plant the flag on the island of Tasmania. So that's just the kind of geopolitical level that it fits into the dynamics of Anglo-French rivalry of the period. But leaving the geopolitics to one side, let's just go here to the show and think about what's going on here in this sealing camp. So what's happening in Tasmania is that there's a kind of the irregular dispersal of escaped convicts and sailors and so on, is a feature of this story. So from about 1810, you have a sealing camp established facing the Bass Strait, which is the water that separates the big island of Australia from Tasmania. And it's really, really polyglot. It includes Americans, by the way, Irish sealers, English sealers, Lascars, and that means South Asian sealers, but also indigenous people who are sealing, Maori and Tahitian. So it's a really, and Australian Aboriginal. So it's a really, really polyglot community of people who take residence as sealers, and the seal trade is a really lucrative one in this era. Now, what I'm interested in here is partly the kind of depiction of this community as pirates, and the relationship between kind of discourses of slavery and what's unfolding here, because one could argue that if there is this geopolitical level, which we've just been kind of attending to, the discourses of anti-slavery and abolition, the discourses of who is a pirate and who is not a pirate, are really, really typical of this age of revolution story. And so these sealers are called sea wolves, they're called pirates, they're called slavers. And so all of these sorts of discourses come to be applied to them. So that's one way in which the story actually kind of links to some of the language of the era. Another way in which it links is that into this sort of community comes humanitarianism. Evangelical missionaries are kind of coming through this world, and George Augustus Robinson is an evangelical humanitarian who tries to rescue Aboriginal peoples in the midst of this story. And he, conducts various friendship missions in Tasmania, but then he tries to quote unquote rescue women from this sealing complex, and he transports them forcibly elsewhere. Elsewhere in Tasmania, Aboriginal peoples are rounded up and taken to a neighboring island, Flinders Island, in the Bass Strait. And the story is really horrific because numbers decline, disease takes a great hold, and debates continue till this date about whether this is one of the instances of British imperial genocide. But beneath the story is a much more complicated one, because actually in this sealing complex there are these very unusual relationships which are forged with Aboriginal women, which are very violent towards Aboriginal women, but it's the Aboriginal women who are actually hunting for the seals because they have the skills, they have the knowledge of how to hunt for seals. And so the gender order of the sealing complex is actually really, really complicated. And that's something to attend to, and we can discuss that if you like. But just to kind of move forward into the kind of story of the war that unfolds in Tasmania in this period. This is a very policed area, one of the most, some people say, one of the most policed sites of this period. But there's also the use of, quote unquote, this horrific thing called the Black Line to round up Aboriginal peoples. And one could argue that these sorts of techniques of warfare and violence actually kind of come from imperial theaters elsewhere. One could argue that people moving across from South Asia, people who've been at war elsewhere in the midst of these Anglo-French rivalries are actually kind of applying techniques from elsewhere into this space. So in that sense as well, there's a kind of connection to this Age of Revolutions story. But this is very soon followed, and this is a story that I kind of outline in this chapter, by land-based colonization. And so this is the kind of counter-revolution which is arising in the midst of this story, because the ideology that the British tried to apply is something which in the period is called systematic colonization. And by systematic colonization, what they're trying to do is to reform this irregular settlement of sealers and whalers into land-based agricultural practice. And so we see the setting up of like joint stock companies, the Van Diemen's Land Company, formed by an act of the British Parliament in 1825. And Van Diemen's Land was the name for Tasmania in this era. So really trying to kind of regularize settlement colonialism and to make it move from the sea to the land as well. So if the sea was this sort of space which was irregular, over which control was difficult, where unusual relationships were forged, which were gendered differently, which were cast as piratical, which were cast as resonant with the language of slavery, here then the land becomes a place which can be settled more regularly, and where agriculture can take off, and where settler colonialism of the kind that we know from the later 19th century can come to be. So that's just kind of one example from Tasmania of what the story looks like. In the chapter, I actually kind of look in detail at the biographies of two Aboriginal people in New South Wales, and I show how their depiction in very racist terms as monarchs, there's sort of a lot of colonial humor surrounding the depiction of Aboriginal peoples. Were these individuals monarchs? Were they republicans? Were they chiefs? That too is actually a kind of way in which this story connects to the Age of Revolutions, because I guess the discourses, the forms of representation of the Age of Revolutions are being utilized here, but applied in order to other indigenous peoples in this space as well. But beneath that and around that, indigenous peoples kind of find their way and try to kind of exercise their agency and to become, more central to the British imperial project as well. That's just a kind of quick survey of that chapter from, some aspects of the chapter. But if you want to ask me more questions, I can fill in some of the details in relation to the things that you're interested in. I think there are some more messages which have turned up in the chat as well, Ebony.
We have a response. Tyrone was saying he loves the idea of revolution as an everyday practice. I think a couple of us thought that. Katie says a corporate view of revolution would be interesting. How often business was used to spread empire, thinking of all of the East Indies companies, Dutch, Portuguese, British. Now this company made by an act of parliament. And then Tom responded, makes me think of Banana Republic here.
Yeah. I mean, certainly the role of corporations. I mean, one, it's absolutely right to think about the East India Company in this context, actually, because there are a lot of East India Company employees moving to, in a sense, having the second half of their lives in Australia and New Zealand and places like this because the weather is better and so forth. They're relocating once they've made their wealth from South Asia to places like Tasmania. I was really, really shocked when I was doing research in Tasmania to see how much Indian furniture there was in museums, as in South Asian furniture from India that there was in museums in Tasmania, and that kind of highlighted how this wealth was moving. But there's also a lot of trade happening between the southern seas and South Asia. So we think of a triangular trade in the Atlantic, but there's also triangular trade between China, India, and Australia in this period. Which is worth attending to because we don't often put those sites together historically because they often kind of sit in different historiographies. Definitely, the relationship between the East India Company and these various companies, but also the movement of settlers between these sites. I think it's also kind of quite unusual to bring South Asia and the East India Company together with Australia, partly because for unacceptable reasons, Aboriginal Australians don't normally, their histories are not normally told next to South Asians, partly because of this whole kind of view from the 19th century of different kind of civilizations, arguably. And so, I mean, even to put together the history of Maori peoples with Australian Aboriginals is something that's happening now, but for a long time this was not done because the fate of the Maori was always cast to be different to that of the Australian Aboriginal peoples, and that too was a kind of racial discourse from the 19th century. So I think in some ways it can be quite exciting to kind of not only bring these histories together with the Atlantic, but actually to kind of bring them together with each other as well, because they've not been, brought together like that before for problematic reasons. Any questions on that at all? I mean, I realize that this is actually quite sort of, how would an American kind of student audience respond to this sort of material, which seems actually relatively far away from America, right? It's kind of the other side of the, it's far south, it's the southern seas, and it's a kind of form of settlement colonialism, which is different in some ways to what's happening in North America, though it's related to possibly. Would it be something that students would be interested in, or would it just be very novel? What do people think? I did mention the Americans in passing there, partly because I was really, really struck at how often Americans turn up in this world in the late 18th century and the early 19th century as well. And the kind of whaling sealing story brings American people all the way here. But I mean, is there another way in which maybe, I mean, is it necessary to have Americans to kind of connect with an American student audience? Maybe not, possibly, right? But is this too far away? I'm just curious to know what your views would be on that. Yeah, Kristen.
I don't think it's at all too far away. I teach world history and AP world history, and I feel like Australia and the Pacific Islands are so left out of world history. And my students are like, one of the questions I ask is like, if you could go to any country, and a lot of them say Australia, and I always feel like they're just so absent in the book. So I think students would be very interested. I'm grateful that you're presenting this. I'm learning. I didn't know this about so.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that's really, really kind of, that's helpful. Yeah, I mean, just the fact that, it's 1788, I mean, that's a kind of easy way to bring it into the Age of Revolution stories, but also the kind of centrality of Anglo-French rivalries in this era. The British are just super anxious that the French are going to come in to Australia and make it, French. And then the whole of the Pacific will, suddenly become French. And so those sorts of paranoias are Age of Revolution's paranoias, but there's also this whole kind of debate about how to found a colony in this era, given republicanism, given the presence of the Irish in Australia as well. What sort of politics should undergird the colony, and does that sort of politics apply only to settlers? And if so, does it authorize violence against indigenous peoples? So different kinds of politics being applied to different kinds of communities as well. So I think more broadly, it could definitely kind of relate to the Age of Revolution's topic. But the literature on the Pacific is super exciting, regardless of the period.
We have several comments in the chat that discuss, the French American and Haitian Revolution. They check the boxes. We do talk about other places around the world dealing with either enlightenment or ideals of everyday revolution practices, like you've been discussing so far in the conversation, is really important. Someone else we have, Isaac said, as far away. As it is far away, it makes it more interesting for his students. Part of what seems relevant is that we have students who have heritage in all of these places in different parts of the world, and they want to hear and see those histories in their classes. That was a favorite comment. To which we have Hannah said, I think everywhere seems far away to a lot of American students. I responded to Hannah and saying my first inclination was actually to, laugh at the comment, but also I'm thinking back to my time in the classroom. That really is a lot of reality for our students, is that any country seems very far away from America. And Alicia says her sense is that students actually want to learn about different parts of the world. And they get a lot of American history just throughout school period. Students also engage with, Ashley says students also engage with the personal narrative approach and storytelling to hook them into a region. They would be interested because it's new and novel, an area not typically addressed in the curriculum.
Great, fantastic. And I think we've got some hands up as well on.
Yeah. Tom?
Thank you. Yes. I teach a sort of elective where I get to choose the subject for my students. And last year it was Polynesia. This year it's Australia.
Great.
Yeah, it's excellent. My wife and I lived in Australia for a bit, so it's an interest of mine that I get to force on my students, but they seem to enjoy it. Because it is this mysterious part of the world to a lot of people, especially, in the kind of smallish town where I teach. But I think there's a lot that relates to American history. There's a lot that relates to people's lives. I tend to tell stories, and I guess my question for you would be, what is a story I could research that was maybe really interesting that you came across, because I've taught kids about the wreck of the Grapham in the Auckland Islands, or Narcisse Pelletier's shipwreck, um, escaped convicts, all of that, Tupaya. But I'm looking for anything else that I can use.
Yes. So basically, I mean, just to kind of pick up some of the points I was making earlier, life life stories are a really great way of making the Age of Revolutions come to life, right? So I'm afraid I don't have the image up on the screen, but I've got the book. If you can see, it's not going to be very clear, I'm afraid, but you can look up the portraits of Bungaree, Bungaree. Maybe you've come across him already, I don't know. But he is sometimes called the first Australian, because he is called an Australian in print. And he's the first person to be called an Australian in print, and he is an Aboriginal man standing, he's often depicted standing on the coastline of Sydney. So what I did in the book was I kind of interpreted these images as Age of Revolutions images, partly because, you know, well, they have multiple interpretations, like many images. At one level, they are just actually his insisting that he should stand in. I mean, he has various relationships with colonial elites and so on, and so it's very much part of his own agency that he wishes to participate, to welcome people to Sydney according to the colonial reports. But at another level, this is like hugely racist, because it is recycled clothes, like naval gear, secondhand clothing he's depicted in, and there's a lot of fun and mockery of him as well in the colonial sources, in terms of the things that he does. So I think it's both. It's not only the colonial gaze, nor is it only his agency. But the fact that he's wearing the kind of military and naval gear of the time, and he's drawn up by this guy called Augustus O, who draws up Latin American revolutionaries and rebels, etc. So there's a sense in which it's actually kind of directly part of that whole genre of portraits of revolutionaries, that sometimes, we have those images in classes on the Age of Revolutions. So we can add, Bungaree into the same sequence of images. But what I did in the story was I actually kind of also tried to recover the perspective of one of his wives, and to say that actually behind this man was also this woman who also exercised agency, and tried to have, and that Aboriginal women were very invested in fishing off the coast of New South Wales. And so this is in keeping with the point I was just making earlier about Tasmanian Aboriginal women sealing, that beneath these sorts of iconic individuals like Bungaree lies an even more complex story of Indigenous presence. So, I mean, that's just one example of a story that could be told, I guess. There's lots of work from Australia. There's Grace Carsken's really wonderful book, The Colony. I don't know whether you've read that, which is full of stories of the spirit of the Age of Revolutions. There are other books that I can probably kind of think of, which might help as well. You also mentioned shipwreck, and actually one of the stories in the book is about Tonga. And I think there's a video of me kind of talking about Tonga, which I use for schools in the UK, which is available online. I don't know whether that will be something that you could take an extract from, but certainly there is the stories of this ship, the Port-au-Prince, which is wrecked in Tonga in the early 19th century, and everything on it is taken and utilized by Indigenous peoples for warfare in Tonga. Weapons, advisors, furniture, I think, as well. And the cannon still are on display in Tonga to this date. There's even a story that, money comes from the kind of idea of currency comes from this moment. and that monarchy is consolidated. That's the argument that I make in the book as a result of the shipwreck. So that, chieftaincy evolves into monarchy. That, by the way, is one of the broader arguments for the Pacific, for Australia and the Pacific in the book. That the Age of Revolutions is a period where new political systems are being debated. Should we have monarchs? Should we not have monarchs? What sort of governors should we have? Curiously, in the Pacific, in certain contexts, we see the initiation of monarchic lines in the Age of Revolutions. And that initiation is partly about, the dispersal of weapons from ships, muskets. It's also through conversations with outsiders about the kings and queens of Europe as well. That's a very long answer to the question, but it's kind of it's nice to find someone who's been teaching on the Pacific. And I think we've got loads more comments in the chat, haven't we?
We do. So Hannah asked, or she stated, I really struggle to find primary sources about colonialism from the point of view of the colonized peoples when taking a more global view. Do you have any recommendations?
Yeah, there isn't, unfortunately, one place to find such sources. So it is a case of gathering them from various places. Yeah, I mean, somebody should do a project bringing all of these sources together. I will have a think about that. Can I answer that question later, Ebony? Is that possible? Because that is something that's happening, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. The National Library of Australia was placed in the comments by Jeff Waterman.
Oh, yeah, that is really, really helpful. Yeah, really. And I think the images of Bungaree and so on are also online. So you can find those, and there's lots of writing about him on as well.
And I think that is it right now.
Okay, so maybe I'll just kind of tell another story as a way of closing, because I've got about 15 minutes or so. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, so this is a story from, somebody asked me earlier, what kind of revolutions are these? Are they, intellectual? Are they cultural? And so on. And I think actually it's all of these things. And as I said earlier, it's partly about the everyday culture of revolution. And because of, the Enlightenment, which was also mentioned by someone, I really wanted to work through how knowledge, new forms of knowledge were very much part and parcel of the Age of Revolutions in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And so I got into this institution, which is the Madras Observatory in South India, as a sort of portal into the Age of Revolutions, I guess. What's going on here is a pendulum length experiment. The idea of a pendulum length experiment is that you measure gravitational acceleration, and from that, you work out the curvature of the Earth. And what's going on here is that there is an astronomer, supposedly a British astronomer, on the left, and two Brahmin, so high caste pundits, intellectuals, taking down measurements of time. Now, this observatory is really central to the regularization of the East. This kind of allows me once again to pick up on the questions, the East India Company's trade. So, because if there are ships going across the Indian Ocean, they have to have their instruments calibrated, chronometers and so on, to determine their location. And so the observatory plays a really, really crucial role in allowing ships to kind of track their path. It's a kind of point of to align your instruments to in this era. But actually, kind of when you look at this institution, it seems like, a data crunching machine. It's about the march of science. It's about the march of empiricism. We can the archive is actually just enormous amounts of data. How much temperature measurements, tidal measurements, measurements of stars, and I was just shocked at how much number there was in the archive. I don't think I've actually been to an archive with so few words. More number, so much number, so many numbers in relation to words. But so one could think of it like that. But when you dig more deeply into the biography, what you realize is that actually it's run by French people who've become British. And these are refugees of the Age of Revolution. So actually, several of the astronomers, well, one of them is actually Danish and then takes on an English name. Another, goes back and forth between France and India. And so it's actually much more complicated than a British empiricist imperial organization. It has this sort of layered history beneath it. And then what you realize is that actually, the kind of counter-revolution of British empiricism is founded in a much more complex story of what passes across the boundaries of France and Britain and the divides of the revolutionary era as well. Then on the other side, what happens is that actually from this Madras Observatory, an expedition goes towards Indonesia, to Sumatra, to actually then determine, it goes towards Sumatra because it needs to find an isolated island from which to determine the curvature of the planet. And the exact curvature of the planet is really important for navigational purposes in this era. But a whole series of revolts and rebellions take off in the midst of these sorts of expeditions. So really the practice of the science is also quite revolutionary. It's not only the kind of astronomers and the elite men, European men who have revolutionary biographies. Actually, a lot of it, the conduct of it, requires expeditions in difficult terrain. Sometimes actually an earthquake actually happens in the middle of one, which is not surprising given the locations to which these expeditions go. Really difficult kind of natural conditions of storms strike as well, in addition to earthquakes. So I guess the point that I'm making here is that it's part of the Age of Revolution story in all of these ways, and it can be quite interesting to kind of broaden our canvas by bringing something like this into it as well, and which also allows us to critique the narrative about enlightened science. What are the products of the Age of Revolutions actually arising only from the other side of the world too. Yeah, so the book actually kind of includes a whole series of cases like this, from Mauritius, from Oman, from Singapore, etc., etc. And it's trying to kind of make slightly different arguments from each case study, but also kind of respecting the fact that the cultural context is divergent in each case. Final questions. I think we have about 10 minutes.
Yeah, we'll open the floor up to anyone who's comfortable to come off their mute and ask a question. Tom, you can go ahead. Yep, if you have a question.
Definitely. Thanks again, Professor. I'm wondering, because I'm very conscious of, the perspective, the European Atlantic perspective versus the Indian Ocean or indigenous Pacific perspective. I think it's easy to, as an American, to kind of say, oh, this revolution here and there, they were maybe influenced by Western thought. Hume, Locke. Is there an example from the time period you studied? I can only think of, in the modern time, Gandhi influencing Martin Luther King. Is there someone from this region of the world that influenced revolution elsewhere that I should be paying attention to?
But you mean in the Atlantic or elsewhere in the Indian Ocean itself, or?
And is there a Polynesian, like Hangi Hika, did he influence a revolution anywhere, I guess, in the Pacific, versus those movements being more influenced by European philosophies?
Yeah, so it's hard to partly because information is traveling orally, and print is taking off slowly. I mean, print is part of the story that I tell in relation to the emergence of public spheres in these port cities in the 1840s, for instance, at the end of the story rather than the start of the story. So I don't think one individual's writings and thinking could have that wide a kind of sphere of circulation. However, it's certainly the case that Hong Hika is iconic as a fighter, right? And that people know about him. Similarly, Tipu Sultan of Mysore is iconic as a figure across the Indian Ocean. So there are figures like that who, through their reputation, kind of embody resistance or conflict of certain kinds in this space. There are also figures, indigenous figures, who are trying to be monarchs in this era or to act as monarchs in this era, who are kind of increasing their reputations. So I can't kind of point. I mean, certainly by the 1830s, there are, Ram Mohan Roy or someone like this in India, who's a liberal thinker. There are people emerging who are kind of writing texts which are circulating much more widely. There are, I mean, chronicles. There are older chronicles, right? Religious chronicles, which are circulating in various ways. But in terms of a sort of person in the era who has a sort of wide impact, it's a bit hard to kind of pin down. It's more the kind of the name or the iconic kind of quality of individuals is significant rather than a particular political philosophy or set of writings. Yeah.
Sure.
Does that
Thank
make
you.
sense?
Are there any other questions?
Looks like Tom's got another question.
I'll add on to that if no one's going to ask anything. Maybe it's my own bias. I'm always sort of torn. As you mentioned, there's an oral history, especially in Polynesia and most of Polynesia and all of the Aborigines in Australia, which I think is very beautiful. But as a historian, it's sometimes sad to think that there's no written record. And did you find that either that made your work more difficult in your research, or that as a researcher, as a historian, as an unbiased writer, you had to sift through these records that were undoubtedly, mostly, overwhelmingly even maybe told from a European perspective?
Yeah, so I mean, genealogies are, I think, what you have in mind, the kind of oral recitation of history and ancestry in the Pacific, a widely kind of found genre on which actually there's lots of really great writing now. Damon Salisa, for instance, from the University of Auckland, has just published a collection of essays. There is this book edited by Miranda Johnson called Pacific Futures, which is a lot of material on how historians might use genealogies as well. Yeah, so for a long time, historians did not use these sorts of sources, but there's also a whole debate about who should use them and who should have access to them, because they're, part of community kind of memory and heritage. And so that's a sort of something else to debate. Certainly in my work, I have kind of read colonial sources very closely and tried to kind of unpick colonial sources, but material culture and visual images as well as colonial textual sources. And so that's the route I've taken. This book does not have any genealogy in it, but it does have some citation of oral history done by others. So scholars like Lynette Russell, for instance, based at Monash, who has this fantastic project on indigenous histories of Australia at the moment. And in an earlier book, she actually kind of used a lot of later oral history of sealing and whaling, for instance. So I think it's possible to, piece together sources like that, which are not necessarily customary kind of genealogies, but more kind of oral history, more broadly conceived. But it's certainly the case that one has to be very, I mean, people were asking about sources and the availability of sources for teaching. I mean, the availability of sources for research is quite scant sometimes for these sorts of topics because, you know, the records are not there, and so one has to use the records very creatively. And so then, you know, teaching the stuff becomes even more complicated, I think, because the research is also still complicated, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you.
All right. Well, Dr. Sivasundaram, thank you so much for taking time out to spend with us this evening. I know it is almost 1:30 in the morning there. So we got to get you off so you can get some rest and be up tomorrow for classes. So thank you so much. And everyone again who is in attendance tonight, 5 lucky folks will receive Waves Across the South, and you'll receive an email tomorrow. But if not, reach out to us if you have any questions, concerns, deep burning thoughts. If you have any additional questions you would like us to relate to the professor, we will be able to take care of that. So join us again for our next OER Project Session Presents. But also, if you haven't received the link or registration, look out. You'll be able to register for our Fundamentals Annual Conference that's happening in March. So thank you. We look forward to seeing you all again. Have a great evening.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you for joining. Good luck. Take care.